Super extreme cut. This time we made 100 bloopers. First of all, we made a color blooper. Second of all, we made a color blooper on the TVO text. Third of all, we made a color blooper on the onward and the Nickelodeon word. Fourth of all, we made a color blooper on the productions text. Fifth of all, we made a background color blooper. Sixth of all, we made a font blooper. Seventh of all, we made a font blooper in the TVO text. Eighth of all, we made a font blooper on the onward and the Nickelodeon word. Ninth of all, we made a font blooper in the productions text. 10th of all, we made a language blooper. 11th of all, we had a different letter in the TVO text. 12th of all, we had a different letter in the Nickelodeon word. 13th of all, we had a different letter in the productions text. 14th of all, we had a fan-made letter. 15th of all, we had a fan-made letter in the TVO text. 16th of all, we had a fan-made letter in the Nickelodeon word. 17th of all, we had a different language letter. 18th of all, we had a different language letter in the Nickelodeon word. 19th of all, we had a different language letter in the productions text. 20th of all, we had a Romanian letter in the productions text. 21st of all, we had a Russian letter in the Nickelodeon word. 22nd of all, we had a different uppercase letter. 23rd of all, we had a different number. 24th of all, we had a different letter that's been added. 25th of all, we had a different letter that's still floating. 26th of all, we had a different letter that's overflated. 27th of all, we had a fan-made letter that's been added. 28th of all, we had a fan-made letter that's still floating. 29th of all, we had a fan-made letter that's overflated. 30th of all, we had a TVO text letter that's been added. 31st of all, we had a TVO text letter that's still floating. 32nd of all, we had a TVO text letter that's overflated. 33rd of all, we had a Mr. letter that's been added. 34th of all, we had a Mr. letter that's still floating. 35th of all, we had a Mr. letter that's overflated. 36th of all, we had a different number that's been added. 37th of all, we had a different number that's still floating. 38th of all, we had a different number that's overflated. 39th of all, we had a big number that's been added. 40th of all, we had a big number that's still floating. 41st of all, we had a big number that's overflated. 42nd of all, we had a bigger number that's been added. 43rd of all, we had a bigger number that's still floating. 44th of all, we had a bigger number that's overflated. 45th of all, we had a Greek letter that's been added. 46th of all, we had a Greek letter that's still floating. 47th of all, we had a Greek letter that's overflated. 48th of all, we had a fan-made Greek letter that's been added. 49th of all, we had a fan-made Greek letter that's still floating. 50th of all, we had a fan-made Greek letter that's overflated. 51st of all, we had an Arabic letter that's been added. 52nd of all, we had an Arabic letter that's still floating. 53rd of all, we had an Arabic letter that's overflated. 54th of all, we had a Hebrew letter that's been added. 55th of all, we had a Hebrew letter that's still floating. 56th of all, we had a Hebrew letter that's overflated. 57th of all, we had a fan-made Hebrew letter that's been added. 58th of all, we had a fan-made Hebrew letter that's still floating. 59th of all, we had a fan-made Hebrew letter that's overflated. 60th of all, we had a Coptic letter that's been added. 61st of all, we had a Coptic letter that's still floating. 62nd of all, we had a Coptic letter that's overflated. 63rd of all, we had a fan-made Coptic letter that's been added. 64th of all, we had a fan-made Coptic letter that's still floating. 65th of all, we had a fan-made Coptic letter that's overflated. 66th of all, we had a Russian letter that's been added. 67th of all, we had a Russian letter that's still floating. 68th of all, we had a Russian letter that's overflated. 69th of all, we had a fan-made Russian letter that's been added. 70th of all, we had a fan-made Russian letter that's still floating. 71st of all, we had a fan-made Russian letter that's overflated. 72nd of all, we had an Armenian letter that's been added. 73rd of all, we had an Armenian letter that's still floating. 74th of all, we had an Armenian letter that's overflated. 75th of all, we had a Georgian letter that's been added. 76th of all, we had a Georgian letter that's still floating. 77th of all, we had a Georgian letter that's overflated. 78th of all, we had a fan-made Georgian letter that's been added. 79th of all, we had a fan-made Georgian letter that's still floating. 80th of all, we had a fan-made Georgian letter that's overflated. 81st of all, we had a Vietnamese letter that's been added. 82nd of all, we had a Vietnamese letter that's still floating. 83rd of all, we had a Vietnamese letter that's overflated. 84th of all, we had a Japanese letter that's been added. 85th of all, we had a Japanese letter that's still floating. 86th of all, we had a Japanese letter that's overflated. 87th of all, we had a fan-made Japanese letter that's been added. 88th of all, we had a fan-made Japanese letter that's still floating. 89th of all, we had a fan-made Japanese letter that's overflated. 90th of all, we had another TV rating. 91st of all, the ABC logo is here again. 92nd of all, the NBC logo is here again. 93rd of all, the CBS logo is here again. 94th of all, the PBS logo is here again. 95th of all, both the Pixar and the Walt Disney logo is here again. 96th of all, the Universal logo is here again. 97th of all, the 20th Century Fox logo is here again. 98th of all, we had two character designs. One is added, and the other is still floating. 99th of all, we made a glitchy blooper. And 100th of all, we made a crazy blooper.